Thank you for coming and welcome to this post-elections roundtable. May dalawa po tayong objectives today. One is we want to list down priority reform measures we would like Congress to look into. During the campaign, we've always had this conversation that this law should have helped address issues. But we knew it was too late then because when we prepared for the election, the Congress had adjourned. So we hope to put this in the agenda of Congress this early so there's enough time to look into these measures. Second, sir and ma'am, we want to know how the media can help you, the organizations, push for these priority measures. And we always refer to the Pera at Politika Consortium that was launched in 2007, Carol, no? Which we're trying to continue, although not in that scale, ano. And of course, a lot of things have changed since 2007. When we were talking about reforms before, we still had some semblance of political parties. The media landscape, the political landscape, they've changed. So I don't know if that will change also the priority reform measures we should push. We'd like to begin this roundtable with opening messages from all of you to summarize what you think should be the priority reform measures of Congress.
For the part of PPCRV, I'm Dr. Arwin Serrano, representing our group. First, we would like to really recommend to Comelec that they start early the procurement process, including the formulation of the TOR or terms of reference with regards to the procurement, especially of the vote counting machine that we're going to use in 2025. If we're going to use new machines, then it should start early. If ever nga, sana this year. Kaya nga we also would not want the barangay and SK elections to be postponed or to be reset because we wanted to finish that this year so that starting next year, ano na tayo, meron na tayong focus on the 2025 preparations. If that will be reset, then magkakaroon pa yan ng additional concerns from our part. Kaya we also would like the barangay and SK elections to be held this coming December 5. With regards to the procurement of new vote counting machines, we would like Comelec sana to have a technology fair in the early part of 2023, if not this latter part of 2022. And then we would like also to highlight also some of the usual concerns, not only from PPCRB but also from other groups. I'm sure other groups representing here today will also highlighting those things, like the corruption of SD cards, the malfunctioning of some vote counting machines, the readiness of the election officers with regards to various concerns on election day, and also on our part, continuing concern pa rin namin yung getting the fourth copy of the election return. Hindi pa rin namin nakuha siya 100% or near to that percentage, but we're very happy because there's a bit of improvement for this election. We were able to get more than 91,000 ERs from 107,785 precincts. So that's a big improvement as compared to the 2016 and 2019. But we wanted in 2025 that we could get nearer to the actual number of ER supposedly given to us. We would like to have more access, especially to the various monitoring activities in many of the Comelec activities, like for example, in the National Printing Office, in technical evaluation or testing, and then also in the hardware acceptance tests, various hardware acceptance tests at Santa Rosa warehouse, including also if we would be allowed to attend important trainings of Comelec, especially of our local coordinators. And then if the procurement process of Comelec would already revert back to the pre-pandemic process. Kasi as you would know, during the 2 years before this 2022 elections, we hardly participate because of the less the face-to-face activities is not permitted. Hopefully, starting the 2025 elections preparations, it will already be back to the pre-pandemic process. So, I think what I mentioned are already the things that you would see in our official report.
Good morning, ako si Paolo ng Namfrel National Secretariat. I'm with the operations ng Namfrel. So as you know, Namfrel monitored yung conduct ng 2022 elections from the pre-election period to election day to the post-election period. On election week and the week before that, Namfrel deployed volunteer observers all over the country. Prior to election day, Namfrel volunteers observe activities such as the delivery of VCMs and election materials to different provinces and cities, public demo of VCMs, and the final testing and sealing of the vote counting machines. On election day, our volunteers observed the opening process, the voting, counting, transmission of results, and canvassing. Some Namfrel chapters were also able to observe the pulling out of VCMs to be delivered to Manila for the random manual audit. After election day, Namfrel chapters also started to communicate with their local Comelec counterparts to request for a list of candidates who have already submitted their statements of contributions and expenditures. A month after the elections, Namfrel submitted to the Comelec a preliminary report of its observations. Ang Namfrel po will release a more comprehensive report very soon and will provide a more complete picture of the elections as observed and documented by the Namfrel volunteers. It will also contain recommendations, especially to the Comelec, to further improve the conduct of our elections, including looking for a more transparent way of counting votes, such as the so-called hybrid system that would involve manual counting at the polling stations, polling places, and electronic transmission of the results. There are recommendations that will appear in that report that would involve legislation, and here are some of them. The legislature should revisit the verified complaint and affidavit requirement in order to formally initiate investigations of vote buying. Complainants and witnesses should also be eligible for witness protection programs, possibly to convince law enforcement officials to act on vote buying incidents they personally witnessed without need for a formal complaint. The law could be amended to impose upon them the duty to arrest those responsible for vote buying when committed in their presence, to seize as evidence all related items found in the scene, and to testify in court or the Comelec on such incident. The law could include a declaration that such acts on the part of law enforcement officers to stop and penalize vote buying incidents is a non-partisan function. So, napag-usapan namin to sa Secretariat, kung ang vote buying is illegal, then why not treat it as an illegal thing? Just like kapag may nahuli silang droga, di ba? So why not do it like that? Next one, the legislature should review the campaign spending limits. Another recommendation that we're going to make in that report is the legislature should amend the definition of a candidate for purposes of penalizing pre-election campaigning. Legislators should also require candidates, political parties, contributors, and media entities to include in their campaign finance submissions to the Comelec the details regarding political advertisements aired before the campaign period. Another recommendation that would require legislation is to amend the Omnibus Election Code so that duly accredited citizens' arms have a right to physical and or electronic copies of all campaign finance documents and attachments. And then the last one that I'm going to tell you this morning is all campaign finance submissions should be made available online. To make this a duty of the Comelec, Republic Act 7166 and the Fair Election Act, which is Republic Act 9006, should be amended. Yan na po. Good morning.
We will have a final report dun sa monitoring nung May elections ng Lente. We'll just submit and provide everyone a copy of that report. But let me talk about yung mga reforms that we would want to see in this new Congress, that we are all excited to see in this new Congress. Kung may genie po tayo at may wish na pwede ibigay sa akin this morning is, now the number one priority that we have always identified every Congress is to have a new Omnibus election code. We all know that our Omnibus election code is older than our 1987 Constitution. So kung merong isang document that could change and that could further improve the conduct of our electoral process, all electoral processes, it should be with the introduction of a new Omnibus election code. But of course, wala naman pong genie at mahirap po talaga with our experience in pushing for some laws, for the revision of some of our laws in Congress. It's really hard for them to focus on such a big document. So there is a need to identify individual amendments or revisions that we could also pursue aside from a new Omnibus election code. One, this was briefly mentioned by Paolo on campaign finance. There is a need to increase our spending limit. Our spending limit was set 30 years ago. And alam na aram ni Carol to na yung piso 30 years ago, it's not the piso now. It's not the piso now. And in one hearing that I think most of us were present in that hearing, that computed the 1 peso 30 years ago to be equivalent to 10 pesos parang 2 or 3 years ago. So iba na rin na naman with the inflation now. So there is really an urgent need to increase the spending limit, to make disclosure of our candidates and political parties to be more truthful. Because we all know that the sources that probably they would submit or that they have submitted to our Comelec, it's not that truthful, as we all know. Let's all be honest about and frank about their submissions. Another aspect of campaign finance that we should all look into is look at the contribution limit. Because of the revised corporation code, now corporations can make reasonable donations to political parties and candidates. So that could be one aspect that we could all look into, and probably I think PCIJ would look into that. What's the effect of the new corporation code as to the campaign finance that happened in this election? Second particular aspect that we could all also look into is on voter registration. What we realized and what we saw during this pandemic is how unresponsive our voter registration legal framework is. Parang everything's going online, but still our voter registration process, we need to go to our election officer's office, we need to line up. With all the technology present, I think we should make use of that technology to make the process, our voter registration process, the first step for our exercise, for the right to vote, to make it more inclusive and accessible. So we're pushing for studying whether or not it's possible to integrate the national ID database to the voter registration database of Comelec, because that would make it easier. That would afford us to skip one step in the voter registration process, which is the capture of biometrics data. And going back to campaign finance, I think one aspect that we also need to consider is on online campaigning. As much as Comelec expanded and tried to include online campaigning in their regulation via the provision on requiring political parties and candidates to report their official online accounts, that's not enough for us to really see how much our candidates and political parties have used online, the different online platforms for their campaigning. So there's a need to revise our Fair Election Act as well to include online campaigning para na mas may leeway si Comelec to monitor the online spending and campaigning of our candidates. Next is on party list. We've all seen how our political dynasties and political families have used the party list system as a backdoor to gain another seat in Congress. Probably may study na somewhere out there probably PCIJ has a study on that, na ilan ba yung magkakamag-anak, ilan ba yung kapatid, anak ng mga politiko na in the party list system. And it's hard to introduce an anti-dynasty provision to cover all positions, but I think it's possible for all of us to push in our Congress. Why not introduce an anti-dynasty provision in the Party List Act to reduce the relatives of political families and political dynasties to use that system as another way to gain a seat in Congress. So their problem of always asking us, we don't have yet an anti-dynasty provision definition. We now have a definition in the SK reform law. So yung problema nila na wala pa namang definition eh. We now have a working definition in the SK reform law that our Congress could just adopt for the revision of the Party List Act. Lastly, ito po, sayang na reform in the last Congress, in the 18th Congress. In Section 55 of the Omnibus Election Code, I don't know if you are familiar, local government units should provide a suitable office space for Comelec offices. And that's a clear conflict of interest when we think about elections and the local government unit. Why is the local government unit the one providing office space for our Comelec field offices? In the last Congress, the House was able to pass this amendment of the Section 55 of the Omnibus Election Code. Unfortunately, it stalled at the Senate level. So hopefully, in this Congress, in this new Congress, in the 19th Congress, this would be taken up again by our legislators together with the increase in the salaries of our Comelec field officials, because clearly there is a disparity between the salaries of the Comelec field officials vis-a-vis their counterparts in other national government agencies. So yun lang po, yun po yung priority na reforms namin, top 4 reforms namin in this new Congress, first regular session. Thank you very much. Magandang umaga po ulit sa ating lahat.
For the media, and I think I'm speaking for the entire media sector, yung gusto ko rin yung genie. to solve our problems, unang-una yung access to documents, to information. So, matagal na po namin tong problema ever since nabuo yung PCIJ, ito na po yung problema. And naging siyang mas mahirap ngayon, yung pagkuha ng mga SALENS and other documents. So, ang gusto sana natin, one of the reforms that should happen is the improvement of access to information. Not just by journalists, but by even ordinary citizens na gusto nilang malaman what's happening in their towns, in their cities and municipalities. Sana they can also have that access. And one of the ways we tried to have this sana achieved is by pushing for the passage of a Freedom of Information law. baby pa yung bunso ko. Pinupush na namin to sa Congress. Nag-graduate na po siya ngayon at nagtatrabaho na siya at hinihingan ko na siya ng pera. Wala pa rin yung FOI. So, but we think the campaign is a success in a way na naging siyang issue ng mga mamamayan. Hindi na lang siya issue ng media. But we want to push this further and sana dito sa ating exciting na bagong kongreso, maipush natin yung FOI. Bukod doon, dito sa last campaign, kita din natin yung difficulties ng media in accessing candidates. How to get them join debates, allow interviews, and also to cover their campaigns. This is also a matter of access pa rin. Pero specifically para dito sa campaign for sa election, tingin namin mahalaga for journalists na merong malinaw na access para maibigay sa mga tao yung information that they need to be able to make that very important informed decision pagdating ng araw ng eleksyon. Yung isang issue pa is disinformation. Na tingin ko hindi lang naman kami yung namroblema. Pero ang question dito is whether this is something that we want to go through legislation or not. But definitely it's a problem that has to be recognized. So yun yung tatlong main issues. I'm sure madami pa, pero yun lang yung may oras. At saka yung Genie, tingin ko hindi ganun ka.
Baka yung FOI, kailangan ni Lord. Si Lord, divine intervention.
Oo. Yun lang po. Thank you.
I just want to share some perspective on how we should look at reform. Of course, when we talk about legislative reform, we want to put on paper policies that we think should, improve things. But there are matters that need not be legislative. You just have to have good people implementing them. For instance, some of the proposals for addressing many of the inefficiencies are actually administrative issues that can be addressed administratively without a law being proposed. I mean, if we are quite modest in our proposal, we could just pray for better political leadership so that good appointments can be done. So probably we want to look at appointment processes as well. Of course, we cannot do anything about appointment of Comelec commissioners as that is constitutional, but probably intervention on how, let's say, critical positions in Comelec will be appointed. Now, second, if we are talking about reform, most of the reform that has survived Congress in the recent history are what I call siguro mga reactionary reform. You see a problem, then you solve a problem, but you do not look at the bigger picture. You do not set what you really want to happen, what we want out of our electoral process. And that's why, in the process of reform, I think what we should be doing right now and starting the reform effort as early as now is a good first step. But there has to be more discussions like this, because what we really need is a consensus, a strong consensus on what we want to push. And when I say we, I'm talking about civil society. I say that because all reform efforts, if we were talking about legislative reform, depends on the political leadership. I mean, we can push all we want, but reforms survive Congress or the government when you have good, committed political leadership who are willing to, which is willing to listen to us. So, yun yung titingnan natin. So, yung process lang siguro. I mean, there has to be a stronger process of aggregating civil society interests in the reform process. We can always look for the genie, But at the end of the day, it's really working and doing the right and the correct strategy uh, for the reform. Okay. Lastly, when we talk about your ideal priority reform, I'll go with ONA. It's the Omnibus Election Code for the same reason that ONA said, because you need laws that align with other laws. You don't pass piecemeal laws and then iba naman hindi ko kontra siya doon sa ibang batas. And that's why we have this problem of substitution, filing of certificate of candidacy issues, these confusions, a weak political party system because, magpapasa ka ng ganito, hindi pala siya aligned doon sa mga ibang batas. And my latest count is that we have about 40 discrete laws. And even lawyers are confused. And if we look at laws, electoral laws, basically, they are that type of law or type of laws that needs to be understood not just by lawyers but by the public. Yun yung nature ng election legislation because that's a you want to empower people, the language, the scope, and the responsiveness of the law should be updated. Comelec actually initiated a 1993 election code in 1993. Just galing sa from the 1985. So hindi pa na matagal yon at that time, but it did not survive because Congress did not think that it was they were ready to pass a whole code. What happened was that ang pinasa yung mga piecemeal laws like continuing registration, isa yan doon sa proposal pero pinasa nila separately. The party list system law napasa din separately. So the appetite for a reform might be something that is challenging. And to get everyone involved in the process is very important. And for advocacy, of course, yun yung pwedeng kuha ng media siguro, to help in bringing together civil society push for policy reform in Comelec. Lastly, of course, yung aming yung perspective mo is always voter-centered. At the end of the day, it's always the voters that you should look. Convenience of the voters, access of voters. And even when we talk about competitive elections and campaign finance, that is because you want voters to have better options when they choose. Not so much because you want candidates to have a chance to people to have a chance to be candidates. It's more like voters having more options or even both better options. So we can even talk about the vetting process of candidates that will be presented finally, or candidates whose name would appear on the ballot. So how can that be done? Political parties, because vetting under any democracy usually is the role of political parties. If we do not fix our political party system, then the problem that we saw in 2022 will again be the problem in 2025, 2028, and we can run all we can. But if we do not get to fix our political party system, then that's going to be happen again.
Sige, yung low-hanging fruit is forever naman to dinidiscuss and dinidebate sa every congressional cycle, increase in the spending limit. Nauna nga lang yung increase in the discount for political propaganda, but the spending limit, the increase in the spending limit has always been deliberated by our Congress. So it's a low-hanging fruit in the sense that they'll be the one at an advantage if ever that revision would be passed, syempre. Second, a low-hanging fruit with Comelec naman is, I think, the further strengthening of the Campaign Finance Office and the Vulnerable Sector Office. These are the two offices in our position, in Lente's position, it should be strengthened more for the coming election. Of course, the Vulnerable Sector Office is to make our elections more accessible, more inclusive to vulnerable sectors, PWDs, older persons, IPs, PDS. And for the Campaign Finance Office, that has always been a problem, and PCIJ is very familiar with the problem of the manpower, particularly of the CFO or the Campaign Finance Office. So if we're talking about low-hanging fruits with Comelec, those are the two offices that we should look at to make or to improve our elections or for the conduct of future electoral activities.
Doon po sa usapin ng Campaign Finance Office, kasi nga po nabanggit po ninyo yung manpower. Paano ba ito, ma'am? Is this an issue of budget? Paano po ba malalagyan ng, kung formally po, yun nga, if we're looking at yung issue ng manpower, kasi parang yun po yung long-standing na issue ni CFO. Ngayon po yan, ramdam na ramdam po namin yung, in terms like, for example, accessing the sources. Talagang ang reason po talaga is manpower, yun yung binabanggit po sa amin. So, paano po ba yun masisimulan or ma-address po yung issue na yun?
Yung laging sinasabi ni Director Prime when it comes to manpower is every election cycle, because it's not a permanent office, they're forced to just rehire or hire new people to be part of the office. So they don't have plantilla items because it's not a permanent office. So they just get job orders, they just get casuals coming from other departments or offices in the bureaucracy. I think there's a need, if we look at it from the perspective of pushing for a change in our law, we want it to be the same as the OFOP or the Office for Overseas Voting. It's now a permanent office because of the Overseas Voting Act of 2013. So that's our hope and our vision for the CFO as well, for it to be more effective and for it to have permanent employees with competency, not just lawyers but accountants, data analysts.
Why limit it to Comelec? Yung pag-examine, hindi ba pwedeng join Comelec Ombudsman COA? Kung magpapasa ka rin lang ng batas. Okay. Ito rin, hindi mo kailangan batas pero pwedeng ipwersa kung kailangan batas. Why not force Comelec to invite civil society group, accountant, yung parang persado sila na sa audit, yung gano'n. May parang multi-agency kung natitingin sa campaign finance. Ang kwan mo doon, transparency and ganun yung principle. Actually, pwedeng gawin ng Comelec yung gusto nila.
Na-share rin po sa atin yung Nielsen data. Hindi naman din po ito bago na po sa atin. We know na every elections, ang laki po talaga nung gastos on poll ads. Pero yung consistent rin po nating nakikita is even though yung Nielsen data based on published rate cards. So like for example po, doon sa data na nakita po namin for during the campaign period, if we're looking at national candidates from president to party list, nasa 18 billion po yung gastos nila 90 days. So that's about 211 million per day. If we were to compare noong previous 2016 elections, although hindi po saktong-sakto ang ating pong data, pero nasa around 54 million per day. So ang laki po nung tinaas niya. But yun nga po, yung paulit-ulit rin na natin pong issue in terms of trying to verify, yun nga yung issue ng transparency. Pagka nakita mo naman yung source nila, it's way lower than than what we're seeing sa Nielsen data. So I guess yun din po, yung pag-reconcile, kasi parang how do you make sense of the figures? Kasi parang obviously yun nga, we know naman na yun nga, likely they are spending more than what is being declared. And that's just the official campaign period. Yung data po sa Nielsen since January 2021, nasa 18 billion din po. So that's a lot of money also. And you see sino yung mga mayayaman din po, yun yung bumibili ng mga ads na ito.
Other than the definition of candidacy, yung definition din ng campaign, yung partisan po, what constitute campaign? Kasi naging controversial yan because of yung Diocese of Bacolod case na may mga advocacy siya, hindi siya considered as campaign. Kung hindi siya considered as campaign, yung gastos doon, hindi mo dapat isasama. So, kung minsan, kahit nandun na yung mukha, kung may advocacy, pwedeng sabihin na hindi campaign yan kasi free speech.
With regards sa voters registration, isa sa mga perennial issue dito of Guia, yung issue about deactivation. Kasi we're also talking about yung human rights issue. So, marami talaga nagpe-claim dito na bakit sila ma-deactivate if they fail to vote in 2 consecutive elections. So, yan yung isa rin yung nare-relate ko rin for so many years na. Aside from the fact yung mga proposals din in both houses of Congress with regards to online registration, which is maganda na rin siya i-consider considering na we're really in the technological age na na pwede na rin siguro na i-consider yung mga various forms of online registration. Plus the fact kung susugan ko lang ng konti yung sasabi ni Atty. Rona about sa use of the national ID na yan na yung parang idikit with regards to the voter registration kasi meron na rin biometrics capture diba? Tsaka parang yun na rin yung ini-envision ng immediate pass administration about yung parang one ID system na for all.
Medyo na-focus tayo sa campaign finance, but I just want to bring up din yung sinabi ni Sir Luie kanina about voters. Like for example, yung Lente, meron silang hashtag atin ang election. For me, that is really true. I think in all of this, parang nakakalimutan natin yung voters. A lot of the complaints of voters really has to do with their voting experience. Parang nakakalimutan natin na, like for example, at the start of the automated election, parang it felt like the voters or the Filipinos were being made to follow a certain procedure that is difficult for them. Parang tayo ang mag-a-adjust doon sa teknolohiya. A lot of the complaints ng mga botante is really about yung experience nila. Bakit ganito yung pila? Bakit hindi namin, like for example, when it comes to transparency naman, it's not really because hindi nila matanggap yung result, at least for many people. It's because na-frustrate sila na hindi nila nakita, halimbawa, how binilang yung boto nila. Parang they're just being made to accept. And it was so fast. Even if wala naman talaga, I think Namfrel believes na wala naman talagang daya na nangyari when it comes to the count itself. But I can see why voters are really frustrated.
Minsan nag-usap kami sa Comelec, yung deactivation, may mga proposal na tanggalin na yun. Pero siyempre, yung deactivation purpose mo doon, ayaw mo papan yung voters list mo. But again, it's a perspective. Kasi gusto mong cleanse, medyo stricto ka. Pero you put the burden on the voter to make sure na maayos yung voters list.
Yung law on vote buying was proposed, but we have anyone wants to say?
Yan yung pinakamahirap. I think yan yung isa sa magiging kung magko-propose tayo ng mga election laws sa Congress, yan mahirapan talaga. Ay pasayan.
Political dynasty.
Yung political dynasty baka nga sakali pa Pero yung about vote buying, napakahirap.
If you enforce yung vote buying na gano'n, like in the community level, ang tingin ng ibang tao, that's a partisan activity. Bakit mo, alam mo yun, bakit ka kukomentan yung ginagawa nun? Dahil gusto mong put down or blackmail yung isang kandidato. And then, doon naman sa side nung nagbebenta ng boto, hindi naman, kumbaga, yung nakaalam na merong nangyaring ganon, natatakot sila for their lives and for their families. So, if there's a way that they can be protected, and without divulging yung kailangan sila magsabit ng kailangan may affidavit, ganon. So,
regarding the vote buying it's a culture already. And from the sociological point of view, pumapasok yung HIA system, pumapasok yung utang na loob system, pumapasok yung pakikisama system. So it's ingrained already, no? So it's difficult to get it out. But yun nga, kung titignan mo yan, hindi siya simple matter. So it's a very deeply rooted, no, sa Filipino cultural system. It has entered the cultural system of the Filipinos.
As much as I hate to end the conversation, maganda yung point ni Pom Luie na this is up to the election watchdogs, of course, to reach a consensus that was discussed. Kami naman sa media ay to monitor what the election watchdogs are pushing. There's an agreement na hiwalay yung mga bagay na kailangan ng batas at yung mga bagay na pwedeng gawin administratively. There's the procurement process was highlighted. It has to be started immediately. And then campaign finance, we discussed this at length. And then the barangay elections. Did I miss any highlight from today's discussion? Siguro yung consensus, sir, mahirap mabuo yun sa isang buuan, ano? Pero this, so far, baka may madagdag pa in the future. Maraming salamat po, and PCIJ is very thankful for the opportunity to hold this roundtable.